This session is intended to provide a high-level overview of the state of science on biomarkers being developed in a variety of contexts in osteoarthritis. And I will start with a brief summary on the regulatory considerations on the use of biomarkers in osteoarthritis. This is a standard disclaimer and disclosure slide, which is self-explanatory. As a way of background, I will briefly discuss the FDA framework on assessing benefit, which was also mentioned in some of the previous FDA presentations, but this is kind of an important point. And this framework has been successfully used in the current approach of drug development and approvals of symptomatic treatments for osteoarthritis. Next, I would share the FDA's perspective on the use of biomarkers and the challenges with developing products that inhibit structural damage or target the underlying pathophysiology associated with osteoarthritis, for which the FDA has issued guidance in August of 2018. Then I will discuss some considerations for future drug development in osteoarthritis before ending with general conclusions. While the information on this slide was very well covered by the participants in session one, it is important to remind ourselves of the significance of osteoarthritis as a public health issue. It causes significant pain and disability, and while many patients can cope with these symptoms, osteoarthritis can be serious by impacting activity of daily living, functioning, and results in the need for joint replacement. The current treatment options are limited to symptomatic therapies with their inherent toxicities, and as a result, there is an unmet need for therapies that inhibit structural progression or target the underlying pathophysiology associated with osteoarthritis. In the next couple of slides, I will summarize the considerations FDA has when evaluating drugs and biological products to provide context for the discussion on the assessing products for the treatment of osteoarthritis. As a basic principle, the basis for FDA regulatory decision-making is weighing the clinical benefits versus the potential or known risks of a product. Clinical benefit is generally defined by an improvement in how a patient feels, functions, or survives. In the context of osteoarthritis, by survival, we can refer to survival of the joint or preventing the end-stage joint disease or the need for a joint replacement. So in that framework, every product is expected to show clinical benefit. Respectively, endpoints in trials of osteoarthritis treatments are also expected to demonstrate the clinical benefit, or at least be interpretable with respect to the clinical benefit to be expected. There are many outcome measures that the FDA considers in clinical program, and each of these have a role and address different questions during drug development. These include clinical efficacy endpoints that measure how a patient feels, functions, or survives, and are used in clinical programs supporting traditional approvals. Surrogate endpoints are measures that are expected to predict a clinical benefit or harm and can be used in certain situations to support an accelerated approval. Biomarkers, on the other hand, are objective measures of normal biological process, pathogenic process, or pharmacologic response to an intervention that may be helpful in early clinical development to identify therapeutic targets, appropriate doses, and so on. Last but not least, there are safety assessments that are also used as outcome measures throughout clinical development, but also can be primary endpoints in some safety studies. To date, products of osteoarthritis have been approved based on demonstration of clinical benefit in two key domains, namely pain and function, using patient-reported outcome measures or PROs that measure reduction in pain, patient global, and or improving function, supporting traditional approval. These domains measure a direct patient benefit in terms of how a patient feels or functions, which can be demonstrated usually with a short clinical trials, as was discussed in more detail by the FDA speakers in session one and also by the discussion in that session. Despite these advances, the clinical benefits related to the inhibition of structural progression or changes in biochemical markers remain elusive to capture in osteoarthritis and remain not very well defined. Determining the clinical benefit in osteoarthritis is complex because the etiopathogenesis of osteoarthritis is complex. Importantly, the relationship between the pathophysiological process and the progression of structural damage or biochemical changes, as well as between these markers and clinical outcomes, is not entirely understood in osteoarthritis. Thus, our ability to rely on biomarkers is contingent on being able to interpret how changes in these markers would ultimately affect the clinical outcomes. And this is because a treatment can affect one of multiple pathways in the pathogenesis of osteoarthritis. And at this time, there are some circumstances, some uncertainties as to what structural outcomes or biochemical markers are relevant, what magnitude or duration of effect on these markers is required to translate into tangible clinical benefits to patients. Given these considerations on the complexity of the disease, what would distinguish a surrogate endpoint from a predictive or prognostic biomarker is that for a surrogate endpoint, a correlation between a biomarker and a clinical endpoint is necessary, but it's not sufficient to demonstrate that an effect on the proposed endpoint will reliably predict an effect on the clinical outcome of interest. This demonstration would be based on empirical evidence from randomized controlled comparisons from clinical trials and or on a comprehensive understanding of the disease process and drug mechanisms of action. These points will be better illustrated by some of the speakers in this session. With difficulty in determining the relationship between a biomarker and a long-term clinical outcome, there are data gaps in our understanding of how to utilize biomarkers, be that X-ray, MRI, or biochemical markers. One would have to be able to clearly describe the clinical benefit expected from changes in these biomarkers. And structural endpoints or other biomarkers, however, may be helpful in clinical development to identify therapeutic targets, appropriate doses, and could be used in addition to clinical outcomes in osteoarthritis clinical programs. Approaches to use structural or other biomarkers as outcomes in osteoarthritis trials would depend on the level of information available to characterize the clinical benefit. For example, with less information, biomarkers may be useful as adjunct or secondary endpoints and in early clinical development. To be used as primary or surrogate endpoints to support approval, a high level of characterization would be needed about the relationship of the endpoints to the anticipated clinical benefit. To address some of these challenges with biomarkers in osteoarthritis, the agency has identified some potential strategies for future osteoarthritis drug development and to help move the field forward. For products for which early symptomatic treatment is not expected or would require quantitative changes in the structural outcome to occur first, a different study design may be needed to capture the direct clinical benefit. The design of such a study can be informed by data, for example, from the Osteoarthritis Initiative, which will be a topic of discussion in session 3. One approach to improve the feasibility of a study would be to use composite endpoints that would capture both joint replacement, for example, and end-stage joint disease, or namely a severe irreversible or intolerable pain or dysfunction that would ultimately lead to a joint replacement. There are also several patient characteristics that are known to be prognostic of the risk of joint replacement in osteoarthritis that could be used to enrich a clinical trial and make it more feasible. For example, a history of prior trauma, prior knee replacement, baseline symptoms, age, body mass index, and others. This is my sensor and light. So in summary, there is a complex relationship between pathophysiology, biomarkers, and clinical outcomes in osteoarthritis. Ultimately, the goal of osteoarthritis treatments is to provide clinical benefit to patients. Thus, the goal of clinical trials is to demonstrate this clinical benefit in order to reliably assess the benefit risk of this product at the end of the day. This slide provides helpful links to some key references where you can find additional information on this topic.